Hello, I'm Krasi Twig. Welcome to this episode of the Global Jigsaw podcast from BBC Monitoring, which is a part of the World Service. We are a multilingual team looking at the world through the lens of its media. Today we're going to talk about language itself and its importance for war propaganda. You might have noticed yourself some of the peculiarities of the militarized language. Semantic distortions and euphemisms are well-worn tools of war propagandists. And Russia's war in Ukraine is no exception.
Демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
От Первой мировой до событий настоящего времени, включая специальную военную операцию.
We'll try to decode the Kremlin's war speak to understand its aim and power. With me in the studio is BBC Monitoring's Russia editor, Vitaly Shevchenko, who is going to interpret the Kremlin's military jargon for us. Vitaly has been monitoring Russia for over 2 decades. He's a native Ukrainian, so he can decipher the crossfire of insults and help us understand how the war is talked about and why. In the second episode of this mini-series, we'll turn to Ukraine's linguistic strike back. Today's episode is all about Russia. So, Vitaly, language. Why are we talking about language? Why is it important for war propaganda?
Well, tragically, Ukraine and the war between Russia and Ukraine is a very good example of how words kill. Without language, without words, none of this would be happening, really. And language matters, well, for a lot of things, including propaganda and war, because it's a key tool which humans use to interpret reality, to understand reality, to process reality. And governments, particularly dictatorial regimes, they build whole linguistic universes to twist reality.
You've been watching Russian state media on a daily basis for the last 3 years and more. How have pro-Kremlin commentators been using this kind of language?
I would say they use it in 3 key ways. Number one is using language to explain reality away, to make people more accepting of the grim reality of war. And key here are euphemisms, i.e. words that downplay and diminish. The second key way is, well, basically making people hate the enemy more by dehumanizing the enemy, making the enemy look like they're not humans at all. And thirdly, language is being used to conceal the true nature of what's going on.
So I'd love to hear the examples in the local language. So when you talk about the euphemisms in language that conceals and maybe points the attention to something that is supposed to be important and stuff that is not important, you're not supposed to talk about. Can you give me examples of those things?
You will have heard about numerous instances when Ukraine targeted oil refineries, weapon storage facilities, and other targets across Russia. So the Russian media, they've come up with the whole language specifically to play down the impact of these strikes. So instead of fires, they say, for example, smoke. There's been задымление. There's some smoke going on. Instead of explosions, they talk about pops. There's just a pop. Who knows what caused the pop? But, it sounds less worrying, less dramatic. Also, they keep talking about things like термоточка, for example, like a thermal point, to explain away these strange phenomena when an arms storage facility caught fire. Also, you can't conceal the fact that Ukraine is using drones against targets in Russia anymore. They hardly ever talk about a Ukrainian drone attack. They talk about falling drones. Russian air defenses, they're so effective. They keep shooting down Ukrainian drones like by the dozen. But somehow, a lot of these drones, they happen to fall on oil refineries and they catch fire and then there's a massive explosion. I have to say that's a trick also used by Ukraine a lot. Another way of diminishing the enemy is the enemy doesn't do something, they attempt to do something. Just this morning, I was looking at reports, Russian reports, about a huge oil refinery catching fire in Ryazan. So one report said Ukrainian drones attempted to attack this oil refinery. There are pictures of an enormous blaze. So linguistically, they're saying it was just an attempt.
And we should say that none of this is unique to Russia as an approach in how they are handling the subject of this war. Dehumanizing the enemy, for example, that is something we have seen in many other conflicts. So what are the examples in this case that you can tell us about?
When Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation, which in itself is a euphemism for war, he spoke about how neo-Nazis and extremists ruled Ukraine.
И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Much of the official reporting of Ukraine in Russia, it keeps talking about neo-Nazis and extremists. They're not people, they are extreme. And there are different words that they use, one of which is ukrop, which means dill, like the herb dill. And the reason why that word gets used to denote Ukrainians, because in Russian and Ukrainian it sounds similar, ukrop, Ukrainец, or Ukrainец. That's why that kind of word is used very often. Also, some of this language, it can be very offensive, of course. When they talk about ukrop being the herb, they talk about косить ukrop, like mowing this herb down, meaning killing Ukrainians. On a more geopolitical level, the Russian Foreign Ministry, specifically Maria Zakharova, the fiery spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, she likes talking about the Anglo-Saxons. If we are to believe her, the Anglo-Saxons are alive and well, and they are plotting against Russia endlessly. In a lot of people's minds, it's kind of very distant and inhuman. It's something they may have read in history books, but they're still alive and well. Take the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian government. They hardly talk about them in terms of the government and its army. They talk about the regime, the Zelensky regime, or militants or paramilitaries ruled or commanded by the Zelensky regime. The thrust of this effort is that it puts a distance, a very significant distance between humans, people, and who Russians are supposed to see in their sights. Inhuman Anglo-Saxons, neo-Nazis, and ukrop.
How are the Ukrainians taking these insults?
Well, as it happens, I've just been talking to some popular Ukrainian comedians, and stand-up comedy in Ukraine is booming. And one after the other, they told me that humor is vital. They don't really have any other choice to survive and stay sane other than take all these linguistic insults with a dose of humor. Ukrop, for example, there's a part in Ukraine called Ukrop. Yeah, we're Ukrop, we're Ukrainian, so what? I mentioned explosions and how they're not really explosions but are pops. This is where it gets slightly complicated in terms of translations. In Russian, pop would be chlapok, yeah? But it also looks like the word for cotton, yeah? So chlapok, and in Ukrainian that would be bavovna. So Ukrainians have used the word bavovna, which is the word for cotton, the word for pop in Russia, as a humorous and a chilling kind of way designation of all these explosions in Russia. They keep talking about how do you like these pops now? I know a lot of this humor is kind of dark and grim, and there's a lot of gallows humor going on, a lot of schadenfreude. This is war. It is grim.
Humor is a powerful way to undermine your enemies. So you understand why they're doing it. But how are the Russians feeling to be the butt of jokes?
These insults, of course, they only deepen the chasm. Of course, Russians are not particularly happy to be called orcs, for example. That's a very popular word used by Ukrainians to designate Russians, to dehumanize them as well.
Мы сейчас поддерживаем наших парней, которые в окопах, орки лезут.
All this tension, all this animosity, to a huge extent, is based on language, on these hugely insulting words that are being used by both sides.
According to Russia, Ukraine is full of Nazis. And that was one of the reasons for this war that was given, was to denazify Ukraine. So all this denazification, knowing that President Zelensky is Jewish himself, a lot of people wondered at the time, what's this about?
If you try and think of something that's unquestionably and unambiguously evil, that's still very much alive in the memory of Russian society, the first thing that will probably come to mind is Nazism. Russians still remember the huge sacrifices made by the Soviet Union in fighting German Nazis during the Second World War.
Для всей нашей страны Ленинградская победа навсегда останется торжеством жизни, мужества и духовной мощи нашего народа, важнейшим рубежом героической борьбы с нацизмом.
Even before the first initial kind of surreptitious invasion of Ukraine in 2014, I remember being amazed by how much effort was spent by the Kremlin to honor and celebrate the Soviet victory over Nazism. The annual parades, the ribbons of St. George, the massive pageantry, the Putin speeches. It was all done to keep that memory alive. We must remember the feat of our forefathers. We must finish the job started by our forefathers. Come 2014, well, things became slightly clearer. It transpired that the job that had to be finished was in Ukraine, and the neo-Nazis that were supposedly rearing their head again were in Ukraine. So the reason why President Putin spoke about denazifying Ukraine in his infamous address launching the special military operation was to whip up support. The associated linguistic universe revolving around this neo-Nazi theme, it's abundant.
It's been nearly 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in Ukraine. How has this language evolved? Has it evolved at all? Have you seen the emergence of new terms and old ones being abandoned? Is denazification still a thing, for example?
It does get mentioned occasionally, but almost 3 years into the full-scale invasion, clearly it's obvious that some linguistic concepts are working better than others. For example, in the run-up to the invasion of February 2022, Russian propaganda kept talking about Russia's highly precise missiles and highly precise weapons. Now look at all the civilian apartment buildings and civilian infrastructure targeted by Russia. Of course, it would be very difficult to explain why these buildings being targeted by Russia or hit by Russia if their weapons are so highly precise. Clearly, one of two things, maybe both things are happening. Either Russia is targeting these buildings deliberately, or their weapons aren't really that precise. So that is one of the words that's being used much less frequently. Denazification, it's in Russian it sounds as clumsy as it does in English. But if you were to ask the question of whether this language actually works, as far as opinion polls in Russia can be believed, most Russians do support the special military operation. However, they struggle to explain the reasoning behind it. What exactly is denazification? One of the phrases that Russian propaganda kept using was that Ukraine was being pumped full of Western weapons. The reason why Anglo-Saxons were pumping weapons into Ukraine was that Ukraine could attack Russia. So that's why the thinking was Russia has to attack Ukraine preventively. Now, what we see is that Ukraine is full of sophisticated and expensive Western weaponry than it was before Russia started its special military operations. So how's demilitarization working? Well, clearly it's not working.
And I'm just wondering, because language is a living organism, and this is almost like the creation of a coded language that people are hearing through their televisions in their living rooms on a daily basis for the last 3 years and more. What has it done to the Russian language? Have people started to take it up in their day-to-day communications?
If you are being bombarded relentlessly by a certain kind of official speak, it takes an enormous effort, an enormous resistance not to take it on board. So things like Special Military Operation or SVO, which is the Russian acronym, they have entered the common language in Russia. A person who's been to the war against Ukraine, who's been to the front line, SVOshniki, like SVO man, even more grim things like code words for victims of this war. For example, Code 200 is a euphemism for somebody who was killed in the war. Code 300 is for somebody who was wounded. There are even words, for example, zadvuchsotilsa means like he became Code 200. He got killed. Or we've heard a lot about Russian troops executing their own fellow soldiers for some kind of offense or wrongdoing. And the word for that, the euphemism for that is reduce to zero, obnulit.
And final question, Vitaly. One of the desired aims for the deployment of this kind of militarized language is to suppress Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian language. Has that worked?
Well, I mentioned the comedians I spoke to just last week. Most of them used Russian in their stand-up performances before the full-scale invasion launched by Russia. Now they're all using Ukrainian. And so a lot of people are trying to switch to Ukrainian with varying degrees of success. And geographically, the difference is striking. Things are moving in opposite directions linguistically. Take my home Zaporizhia region in eastern Ukraine, which is partly occupied by Russia. In the occupied parts, the Ukrainian language is being exterminated. You're not supposed to speak Ukrainian. You're not supposed to read Ukrainian books or even listen to Ukrainian music. So it's almost exclusively Russian-speaking now. But 5 kilometers westwards across the front line, people are switching to Ukrainian precisely because of this resistance to the pressure to start speaking Russian. So forcing Ukrainians to speak Russian is a key objective of the special military operation. Forcing Ukrainians to consume Russian culture more, to become part of the Russian world. That's an official idea, that's an official slogan, if you like, used by the Kremlin a lot, become part of the Russian world. But what Ukrainians are doing, they are distancing themselves from the Russian world.
Thank you very much, Vitaly Shevchenko, for your insights and for suggesting this fascinating topic. In our next episode, we will examine Ukraine's answer to Russia's language of war. Thank you for watching from the Global Jigsaw podcast team, and let us know what you think by emailing us at theglobaljigsaw@bbc.co.uk.